Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Kelly Becker, Executive Vice President of Ipsos Canada's Innovation Practice. Kelly, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen, and hi everyone, and thanks for joining today. So where did the idea for this webinar come from? Well, we've been having lots of conversations with our clients over the past while about innovating in these inflationary times. We're getting asked questions like, what are the key success factors I should be thinking of? Should I be downsizing versus raising price versus reformulating? All really good questions. And between all of these discussions and the many engagements we've had with our clients over the past 2 years and in inflationary times in other markets in the past, the reality is we've amassed a lot of learning that we want to be able to share with you today. So my goal over the next 45 minutes is to walk you through some key considerations, lessons learned, concrete case studies to hopefully inspire your thinking and help your organization increase success rates of innovation and renovation in this inflationary market. To start off, I'm going to take us back a couple of years to the second half of 2021, because that's when we really started to see news headlines dominated with rising consumer prices. And you may be thinking, Kelly, why are we talking about 2021 when we're sitting here now halfway through 2023? And the reason is because inflation hasn't gone away. Yes, we've seen the rate of inflation slow versus last year, but it remains a major consideration for Canadians. When we look at our very recent tracking of Ipsos's Global Inflation Monitor from just this past spring, we see that Canada remains one of the most pessimistic countries, with the vast majority of us believing it will be at least a year until inflation returns to normal, if ever. And we're right up there. Moreover, Canadians are finding it difficult to manage financially compared to other countries that we track. In fact, we see half saying that they're either just getting by financially in Canada or even finding it difficult to manage specifically. We see that in 3 in 10. Now that's sobering enough, but what makes this particularly sobering is that, again, we see Canada really right up there out of the 29 markets we polled. And what's telling about that is that we've been doing global surveys for many, many, many years, and time and again, Canadians tend to sit middle of the road, not on either extreme. So the fact that we really are sitting on the extreme here shows that it's quite telling how difficult Canadians are finding it to get by right now in terms of their financial situation. And I promise I'm not going to sit here and depress you for the next 45 minutes. This is my last slide to lay the land. But if we look at 2 more data points, it helps us see a little bit more of the picture that consumers are facing. Not only are they finding it difficult or just getting by right now, but when looking towards the future, over the next year, a little more than 4 in 10 Canadians are saying that they're expecting their disposable income to continue falling, compounded with 3/4 of Canadians expecting the cost of food that we need to really buy weekly to go up. And while not shown here, food certainly wasn't the exception when we looked at many different categories and sectors: apparel, entertainment, utilities, and gas. Across the board, an overwhelming percent of Canadians are expecting to pay more over the next year. All of this to say, it is a challenging time for consumers in terms of stretching their dollars for virtually anything they're considering purchasing. Now, not only for consumers, it's a challenging time for business leaders, innovation leaders like you on this call, who, in addition to being consumers yourselves, are firefighting emergency priorities, rising cost of goods, stock shortages, rapidly shifting consumer sentiment. And we know that you're facing difficult choices here. Do you go back to the drawing board and start again with your innovation pipeline? Do we need to only be launching value tier or value line extension products right now and veer away from everything premium? How do we make our innovations price or inflation resilient? Do I renovate with a lower cost formula? Do I downsize? Do I take price? Do I do a combination of these? All very good questions that we want to walk you through today. And so we want to spend, like I said, time going through what is our perspective on those questions. But before we get into the meat and potatoes, if you will, I want to spend 1 minute, maximum 120 seconds, to ground everybody in what we believe in, what our approach and philosophy is in Ipsos, for those of you who are less familiar working with us. And the idea there is really just to contextualize what are the research considerations that are reflected in all of the research that led to these findings. And so a few things. First and foremost, our entire innovation practice at Ipsos is premised on the importance of understanding how your innovation or renovation fares and benchmarks against the competitor. Because the reality is, and we have 40 years worth of research on research and academia to support this, is that we as consumers are human beings who are creatures of habit. We tend to default to the status quo because every time we buy a new innovation, there is potential for it to be a risk test. Even if it's a $4 risk, maybe we won't like it as much as the product we buy today. And so to understand if an innovation with a price increase, downsize, new innovation to compete in this world is enough to disrupt that status quo, we need to understand how consumers are benchmarking or perceiving the innovation relative to that most appropriate competitive set. Their repertoire, their consideration set as a consumer. So we always incorporate that notion of competitive benchmarking and assessing if your innovation is giving enough end benefit for consumers to disrupt what they're putting in their cart normally and put this new product in their cart. We also believe that any innovation research is really simulated test marketing. And we're doing this to predict what's going to happen in market. Well, the best way to be predictive is to mimic that in-market reality as much as possible in how we're collecting our data and doing more and more choice-based tasks to complement or even replace scales. Why? Because when as a consumer, you're making a decision at the point of sale, you're not sitting and doing a scaled rating question for all of the products you're looking at. You are making a choice, and that's what we want to replicate in our research. Beyond choice-based research, which in and of itself is an element of behavioral science, we use other elements of behavioral science like implicit reaction time to denote conviction of choice. Because we've been able to prove out, and I think it's fairly intuitive, that when we complement, traditional research approaches with behavioral science, we get even more predictive power, more discrimination between options for a better or more granular understanding. And lastly, we know that these portfolio optimization, pricing optimization, renovation decisions are big and complex ones that often have a lot of risk to your current buyer base, especially if it's a renovation, but even for a new innovation. And that you need to feel confident. You need to have quantification of the impact of, do we downsize or do we increase price or do we introduce a new claim? And so we always link our research to our globally validated, highly robust forecasting model to give you greater confidence in the quantified risk or even potential upside. Okay, with that, let's move into our 3 chapters of innovation considerations in these inflationary times, that if I was in your shoes, these are the things that I would want to be thinking about. The first thing is really understanding the pricing landscape. What do I mean by that? Yes, there's price elasticity, but there is a really wide spectrum of elasticity across different categories, whether we're in an inflationary time or not. And so to really understand what will drive where your category sits in terms of how price elastic, there's 3 considerations to be thinking about. One is, how elastic is the category or the need in and of itself? Is it a staple, can't live without product category like flour or like salt? Or is it something that's maybe more of a luxury or a treat or a nice to have, like a scented candle? Even if the need or the notion of that category in and of itself is inelastic, there may be good substitutes. So for instance, it may be that for years, consumer X would pay the premium for convenience of getting a ready-to-eat meal from the HMR section. Perhaps under pricing pressure, there's now some consumers are now going to be switching to homemade meals, not getting those meal kits or the HMR solutions, because there's other ways to meet that need with more affordable options. So knowing which other categories or products your category is interacting with is an important piece of the puzzle in understanding who is your competitive set when it comes to price and ultimate purchase decisions. And then when you have a sense of what are the substitutable alternatives that consumers have at their disposal, it's taking a look at those alternatives to be able to understand how much they're being impacted by inflation relative to your category. Because one thing we've learned time and time again is that there is a huge difference in how certain categories are being impacted by inflation. To recap, or one way to think about it is that you're going to have a more price elastic category, meaning more impact to your volume when price changes, or if price increases, the more elastic you are, the more volume you will lose or your brand will lose when price increases. That's elasticity. So we know that elasticity for a category is larger when the demand itself is elastic. I need this product, or sorry, I don't need this product, when there are plenty of substitutions, or when the cost structure of those alternatives or substitutes is more attractive to consumers than your category. Now that's looking at some of the main principles, but let's look at an example. And I'm going to take you back 20 years. Don't worry, we're coming back to this year in Canada on the next slide. But really interesting what we saw when Turkey and Argentina went through hyperinflation cycles at the turn of the millennia, actually, due to currency fluctuations and economic turmoil. Now, in Turkey, between 2000 and 2001, we saw that food and beverage spending overall declined 17%. Doesn't mean people were eating less, looking for less expensive alternatives, likely more homemade. But let's just compare and contrast. I thought this was fascinating. Meat, dairy are both, staple categories as we think of them anyways in North America. Packaged dairy in Turkey that year, spending went down 8%. Compared to a mind-boggling 31% for packaged meat. Likely, consumers in Turkey at the time were looking for more affordable protein sources than packaged meat. Personal care spending overall didn't go down as much as food because maybe it's less elastic in certain ways. And one could argue that, well, hair care and paper products are all essentials. Well, maybe, yes, we need facial tissue and bathroom tissue. Maybe there's some substitutes. Spending only went down 6%. But look at hair care, went down 16%. Maybe it was the styling aids and the gels that are not considered essentials, and spending went down on that. Lastly, if we look at Argentina, we see staples like tea and butter, spending only went down maximum 5% for those. But mineral water and even packaged snacks went down 40%. Astronomical. And again, consumers likely didn't stop snacking, but they looked for cheaper substitutes, or perhaps limited how much that they were purchasing and eating. I promised I would take you back to a Canadian view. And what we're going to look at is some data from our Ipsos Essential Trackers from literally last month, so hot off the press. And it'll show that the way consumers view different food and grocery categories, whether they be essentials, treats, something I could postpone, something I could trade off, there's some differences. So even when we look at some of the most prevalent categories, not surprisingly, we see that still the vast majority of Canadians look at fresh produce, pasta, rice, meat, bread as an essential, 74 to 85%. Well, still the majority, but less overwhelming, do we see that for what I would have thought are staple dairy categories like cheese and cream and maybe even yogurt, not as many thinking of it as an essential, and in fact, 1 in 5 thinking of it as a treat. Perhaps more interesting, and I did a little bit of foreshadowing a minute ago when I was talking about substituting pre-made or ready-to-eat meals for something that's less ready to serve, that you need to actually prepare yourself. We're seeing that substitution actually come to play, because when we look at the data, the same data from January of this year, 25% of Canadians thought of pre-made meals as an essential. That has now dropped to 20% and will be really interesting to see if it continues to drop over time. I'll spend a little bit less time on non-alcoholic beverages, but there we see even more differences, stark differences, in the extent to which consumers think of different beverages as essential or not. And really, milk and milk drinks are the only one that have the overwhelming majority. In the interest of time, we're not going to get into it today, but interestingly, we start to see, really unravel more and more insights, not only when we track this over time to see how sentiments are shifting, but when we start to cut the data by haves and have-nots. Fascinating insights. And for anybody who's more interested in Ipsos Essential, please do connect with me after this webinar, and I'll make sure to connect you with the right Ipsos colleagues. But again, what we're seeing here is not all categories are hit the same way in terms of how much consumers are still willing to prioritize to spend on them. And that's at the category level. Where you typically reveal even more granular understanding that's more actionable for you in an innovation space is to look at the different segments within your category that you could be innovating in. And so in this example that I'm sharing, one of our clients in Southeast Asia make kids' milk formula, starting all the way from newborns through to stage 4, which is up to 7 years. And knowing that there was relatively less elasticity in this category than others, there was a hypothesis that there would also be pretty stark differences in elasticity depending on which age or stage the parent is feeding their child in. So the way to look at, so what we did was we basically did a choice share exercise, a choice task exercise, where we had different pricing on different formulas at different stages and had our parents of kids those ages go shopping. And we looked at the elasticity in all cases, and we set the elasticity of that stage 1 newborn formula as our baseline at 100, because there was some elasticity, but very, very, very little. And we're looking at how, in these next bars, stage 2, 3, and 4 formula, how their price elasticity compares to stage 1. And the net is there's a lot more elasticity as the child gets older. Or in other words, the parent is much more willing to consider substitutes to purchase instead of formula, homogenized milk, whole milk, whatever it may be, tablet, baby cereal, once they pass that 6-month mark. And that really confirmed to them that knowing that they were going to have to take price on their business, that their innovation priorities and strategies were really rooted in that stage 1 formula products, where they were most likely going to be able to take the price while minimizing the volume loss. And you may be looking at this and saying, oh, that's obvious. Of course, there's going to be less substitutions and less elasticity at stage 1 for newborns. But this is just an example. The same premise applies whether you're looking at different segments of granola bars or soup. You may find pretty stark differences that will help you figure out, where do I want to focus my innovation efforts? Now that I know which ones have least price elasticity, that's an important cue for where I focus. Okay, so once you've decided on your category, what's your segment strategy for the innovation? The next thing to think about is how do you find that right competitive pricing space for your next innovation or renovation project? And we can do that fairly simply by understanding cross-elasticity or price interaction between you and competitors. And so what this cluster map is looking at are clusters of brands or products that really interact with each other in terms of when one increases price, the impact on the other is felt. They compete most with each other and are most impacted by pricing differences. And so if you're looking to innovate, you're gonna want to know what about this cluster where it says main competitor and existing brand, and actually that the need, particularly if you want to have more pricing resilience and more ability to charge a premium, is to innovate away from this cluster. So to understand, what are the key drivers in that cluster? What are consumers looking for? Okay, but that's not where we want to be. We want to maybe be here or here or here. So again, it just starts giving you direction about, which segment do I really want to focus on for my innovation? And what do I know about things in that cluster in terms of how do I position myself with an advantage or a point of difference so that I can reduce my pricing vulnerability? Okay, this next section I think is probably the most fun and interesting, and where we're definitely going to focus on quite a few case studies from across the globe. And the next consideration is developing a pipeline resilient to inflation. Well, that's all well and good, of course, but how do we do that? And that's what I'm going to talk you through. And the first principle in developing an innovation pipeline that's resilient to inflation is bringing that differentiation. And I mean true differentiation. Many of the things that we test, consumers think of as me toos, right? And differentiation is what reduces substitutability because you're inherently providing something that's not already out there. That's why it's seen as differentiated. You can thus better withstand the increase and support premiumization. Now, you may say, premiumization, what? We're in inflationary times. Half of Canada thinks we're in a recession. Is there a role for premium innovations right now? And there absolutely is. While it may feel more intuitive to go after value tier line extensions in inflationary times, and they absolutely have a role, so do premium innovations if they're done right. What I mean by being done right is addressing an unmet need, providing enough benefit that consumers aren't getting from something else that's available to them in the market, that they're willing to pay that price premium. And again, we've seen many, many cases where innovations have successfully done that in peak inflationary times by really nailing down what is that unmet need and solving it. And we can then, the value of doing it is when we look at research and data over the past, 20, 30, 40 years, time and again, we see that during inflationary times or not, overall, premium and super premium products have lower price elasticity than their mainstream peers. So for instance, in the US, we know premium tier toothpaste has 40% less price elasticity than products in the value tier. They are going to be much, much less negatively affected from a volume standpoint if price is increased. China, super premium skincare products have almost no elasticity. I mean, 0.3, it's not almost no, but it's a very, very low number. Way less elasticity than mainstream skincare products. So not only do premium innovations have a role if they're done well, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples on the next slide, but they can actually be really, really important to counterbalance any margin decretion you're taking. Sometimes the value products that you're launching have lower margin. And so if you need to be able to mitigate that, the right premium innovation done properly offers a really good opportunity to do that. Okay, so this is one of my favorite examples, and it's from Brazil, a country in which instant coffee is much bigger than it is here in Canada. It's quite a high incidence category, but for a long time it was very commoditized. Really difficult to stand out and certainly to charge a price premium. So we worked with one of our clients whose goal was to deliver on an unmet need, which is to get the cafe experience at home, because they found a technology that was now enabling them to get that more authentic froth, that espresso froth, when consumers made it at home. So when we tested it, we found out a few things. We see that when we tested the initiative, it had really strong trial potential. This is a normative ranking against our database. And why did it have strong trial potential despite being seen as really expensive? Because addressing that unmet need gave enough relevance and differentiation to consumers that the price premium was justified, and there was very strong trial potential for it. Moreover, when we look at the right-hand side of the slide, we see that by introducing a relevant and unique benefit that solved the unmet need, in fact, the client did achieve their goal of decommoditizing and being able to charge a price premium for this innovation. Because in the pricing sensitivity work we did, we were able to prove out to them that with this instant espresso, there was much more pricing resilience or less volume or share choice lost for every price increase than there was even for the category leader. So premium done right with differentiation that's meaningful because it solves a need can be extremely successful even in inflationary times. And that notion of differentiating isn't only applicable to completely new to the world products, but also when renovating. So we worked with an analgesic producer in the US who knew that they were going to have to increase price on one of their core products. And so instead of just putting through a price increase, it was actually part and parcel of a more holistic relaunch that was led by a new technology that allowed the brand to claim superior absorbency and faster action to really provide a compelling point of difference from competitors. And when we looked at pricing sensitivity analysis, we see that on the left-hand side, without the relaunch, just looking at the current product and if it was trying to increase price, there was quite a big drop in volume, right? So for every 1% increase, sevenfold more loss, whereas less price elasticity, less volume loss with the relaunch proposition because it was providing something important to consumers that other brands weren't doing. So new news that matters to consumers can absolutely cushion the fall from a price increase and actually potentially even get you to a higher volume for the brand than currently. Okay, so we've talked about differentiation. Let's also talk about superior claims as a way to build differentiation and to better justify a price premium and improve the value equation for consumers. This next example is from some research on research that Ipsos funded, so it wasn't from a specific client. And what we wanted to do was understand pricing resilience of different shampoo brands and how that pricing resilience changed when going beyond kind of cost of entry or core claims like deeply moisturizing, deeply hydrating, nourishing. So some examples of beyond the core claims would be sustainable packaging, no silicone, sulfate-free. And we had consumers do a choice exercise where they were shown many different pairs of shampoos with differing claims, core and beyond the core, and differing prices. And what we found was that when only making kind of those core category entry claims, the win rate of the shampoo or the propensity to be selected by consumers dropped 11% every time price increased by $1. However, when that same product or brand would make beyond the core claims, the volume drop from a price increase was substantially less, half actually, at only a 6% volume drop versus the category claims. So it's showing how superior claims that matter to consumers can really increase price resilience. And I say that matters with a lot of emphasis because a huge part of the exercise before making a new claim on an existing product that may or may not justify your price increase is really nailing down which claims do give permissibility to payer or permissibility to price increase. And that can be very, very nuanced. So I'm going to give you an example to make that point. We worked with a global beverage company in the US who knew that they were going to have to take price across the board and were looking to renovate one of their core beverages with a new claim. And so they wanted to understand out of 20 different possible claims, which would best support that price increase. And probably not too surprisingly, most of the claims, 2/3, proved to be ineffective, didn't do anything to curb the volume loss by increasing price. However, there was one claim, the winning one, that was able to support almost a 30% increase in price. I mean, significant, without losing an ounce of choice share that can be translated into market share. And it wouldn't be enough to just say, oh, we need to go into the health and wellness space. there were a bunch of claims tested in the health and wellness space, and it was only that particular one that was able to justify the price increase. So again, I think the lesson learned is being really sure you have a firm grasp on what consumers are willing to pay more for. What is the claim? Because it may not be what you think it is before going ahead with that. Kind of close this part of the thought. The one part of the equation is understanding which claim justifies the premium, but a really important puzzle as well is, does your brand have permissibility to make that claim? So we were also working in the US with an Italian food producer, and it came to be that the claim authentic imported ingredient was one of those permissibility to pay claims, showed less pricing sensitivity. But part and parcel of that research was also looking at brand fit and brand credibility to make that claim. And in fact, we found that only one brand in the client's portfolio had the equity to effectively convey that claim. For the others, not only wouldn't it have been effective, it would have been a risk because it created credibility or believability issues for the brands that didn't have the equity to support that. So really understanding not only what consumers are willing to pay for, but which brands have the permission to make that claim with good credibility is also important. I'm going to give this example because I find it a fascinating one. So remember, one of the things I spoke about at the beginning is that competitive context is everything because consumers never make decisions in isolation. Nothing is cheap or expensive in absolute. It's cheap or expensive to what the alternatives are. And innovation development and positioning can definitely trigger consumers to benchmark to higher priced competition, giving you more pricing resilience. So let me just take you through this really neat example from Europe. So we worked with a client and did some research together to look at what happens with price perceptions as well as trial potential for different incarnations and positioning of a new soap, hand soap. And so when the soap was put in, a regular pump, a disposable single-use pump for $2.49, consumers were benchmarking it to other hand soaps on the shelf, and they actually found £2.49 to be expensive. I guess soap is very cheap there. However, the same formula, but now carried by a manual pump that's not disposable, we found that consumers now were actually comparing this when we asked them, what this would replace and what the competitive set is to bathroom gadgets. And in the context of other bathroom gadgets, 12 pounds was neither expensive nor inexpensive, pretty middle of the road. So that $2.49, too expensive. 12 pounds for the manual, not bad. Scenario 3 is where it gets really interesting. Now powered for automatic or motion detective, dispensing, we are now looking at 39 pounds. Consumers are actually comparing it not just to bathroom gadgets, but to small kitchen appliances like a coffee maker. And in that context, they found the 39 pounds a very good value. Why? Because in this incarnation, not only did we shift the competitive set, the client was much better delivering on an unmet need. I don't know about you, but I can't tell you how many times before they invented these things, I was dealing with raw meat in the kitchen, and then your hands are dirty and you don't want to pick up the actual container and make it dirty to dispense the soap onto your hands. So by delivering that unmet need and by positioning it as competing with other kitchen gadgets, the value equation in consumers' minds completely changed, as did the trial potential for this initiative. So hopefully it inspires just a little bit of different thinking. Okay, we're going to finish up here, and I'm just doing a quick time check. I know we're running out of time. May go a little bit long, and we'll have the recording for those who can't stay. There's that age-old question of, do I raise price? Do I downsize? Do I do a bit of both? Do I give it a completely new look so they can't even compare it to the size and price before? Do I go with a lower cost formula? Now, downsizing can be an effective way in the short term to, mitigate the negative impact of a straight price decrease. And in fact, and this is where you really want to have a shelf context where consumers can see, like, if the package is supposed to be smaller now, let's incorporate that so that we can reflect that reality. And in this case, we worked with a US salty snacks maker who was trying to decide, do I raise price, do I downsize, or do I do a little bit of both? And it showed that the downsize straight downsize was most effective in combating volume losses with price increase. So an almost linear volume loss to price increase if they just increased it, but very low elasticity if it was a downsize as opposed to the price increase. Well, and that's all well and good and is important to understand, don't get me wrong. But that's only one piece of the puzzle because it's a short-term view. That is only for the next purchase, or if it's, a new buyer for their trial purchase. The real possible risk of downsizing or reformulations comes longer term, where now the consumer's actually seen how much product is in there and are potentially disappointed. And the only way to really understand that is not from a conceptual or shelf test, but a usage test, right? Central location or at home, but to be able to see how quickly is the consumer going through the product now, and what impact does that have on my volume? Well, what do I mean by that? In all of the work we've done over the past 40 years on downsizes and reformulations, we found a few principles to be true. Honesty and transparency are important. And what I mean by that is that you want to minimize the risk that when the rubber hits the road and consumers actually go to open that product, that package, they're not super disappointed, right? So I don't know if any of you have ever opened that bag of chips and realized how much more air there is now than there used to be. Or I used to get 6 granola bars. I didn't even notice when I went to buy this at the shelf that now it's down to 5, and I only noticed when I opened it up. Having a sense and a gauge of that disappointment and the impact it's going to have to your business and potentially repeat buying and perhaps alienating some of your buyer base is so incredibly important to understand and quantify that potential risk before you go ahead and do the downsize, or before you go ahead and do the reformulation to the lower cost, seeing what the potential long-term effects and risks are, again, through usage studies. The other thing to keep in mind when downsizing in frequently purchased categories is that if you're giving the consumer less product, you're now putting them back in the market quicker and giving them another opportunity to switch brands even quicker than before. So again, it's one of those factors that you want to consider and try to measure before making a downsizing decision. And then lastly, it's really important to be vigilant in tracking consumer response, major disappointment, feeling like the wool was pulled over their eyes, as well as competitive activity or response to what you've done. And again, this really applies to downsizing as well as formulation changes. So I'm going to finish off in the next couple of minutes with just a reminder of, what sets Ipsos apart to help you make the best pricing decisions, the best renovation decisions, the best innovation decisions in these challenging times. Everything we do has a B-side angle. Everything we do has a competitive context, seeing if the innovation is disrupting the status quo bias. We want to reflect reality as much as possible. And so if you bear with me for another minute or so, just a few ways to bring to life how we do that in the context of pricing research is we bridge the say-do gap, right? So a lot of models can be calibrated somewhat to what the current price and the current volume is, but there's limitations. Ipsos links all of our pricing and renovation research to our globally validated forecasting model, where we've thousands and thousands of validations so that we really understand how to accurately calibrate what consumers say they're going to do to what they'll actually do to give you accurate volume projections. Secondly, we don't believe in unrealistic forced choice. When we do choice tasks, we also include anchoring questions and some other analyses to get a better discrimination of, did you just choose the best of the worst, or did you choose that because you actually want it? So we do some advanced modeling to provide better discrimination and prediction by stopping unrealistic forced choice. And then we think about the consumer decision journey holistically. For certain products, and granted, this often applies even more so outside of packaged goods, which I know a lot of you are in, but even for packaged goods, there are sometimes friction points that minimize some of that interest in this product from being converted into an actual purchase. And so we're always looking with a lens of what are the possible friction points that we need to be thinking about and measuring if they're going to have an impact in terms of your success potential. So to summarize, what we do is we account for how people are actually making decisions in this actual environment and translate that into actual behavior. And I know that we're pretty much out of time, so I'm going to turn it back to Ellen. I think we will leave any questions that come in for email follow-ups so that we can make sure we get you all on your way. And like I said, Ellen, back to you now.
We did get some questions. Those will be followed up by email. In the meantime, be on the lookout for a link to today's recorded presentation. It will come through perhaps tomorrow or very early next week once we get it up online. Of course, there was a paper that we've uploaded into the handout section, so feel free to download a copy in the meantime. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye, Kelly.